The hallway outside the Harper residence's kitchen was dimly lit, the only light coming from the small chandelier that hung above the staircase. It was almost midnight, and the house, normally quiet and orderly, was filled with tension. Nathaniel Harper, or Nate, as everyone called him, had returned home from a late-night study session at the local library. He had hoped to sneak in quietly and head upstairs without waking anyone, but he paused at the foot of the stairs when he heard voices. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop. But the sound of his name, uttered in a tone that carried both anger and pain, froze him in place. "You should have never brought him into this family, Linda." That was his father's voice. Thomas Harper. Cold, sharp, and rarely loud unless he was furious. "You always say that when you're angry. But Nate is our son, Thomas." His mother's voice, Linda Harper, was softer, but tonight it trembled. There was exhaustion in it, defensiveness, even sadness. Nate held his breath. His fingers clutched the strap of his backpack. He felt the fabric tighten against his chest with each shallow inhale. There was a pause. Then came the words that shattered something inside him. "He is not our son. He's not your blood. He's not mine. He doesn't belong in this house. Brandon knows it. That's why he resents him." The air in Nate's lungs escaped all at once. His knees wobbled. For a second, he wondered if he had imagined it. But no, his father's voice had been crystal clear. "Not your blood." He staggered backwards silently, pressing his back to the cold wall. He hadn't made a sound, but it didn't matter. The conversation continued behind the half-closed kitchen door. "You promised me we'd treat him like family," Linda shot back, her voice breaking. "He was just a little boy when his mother died. I couldn't leave him in that hospital with no one to claim him." "You got too attached, Linda. I agreed to help temporarily. You wanted to keep him like some lost puppy. He grew up calling you Dad, Thomas. And he's not." Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that stretched, sharp and heavy, like the seconds right before thunder cracks. Linda finally whispered, "You don't see it. But he's more of a son than Brandon has ever been." That sentence made Nate's heart twist. He didn't want that. He had never tried to replace Brandon. In fact, he had spent most of his life avoiding conflict with his older brother. Brandon had always made it clear Nate was an intruder, an imposter in the Harper home. But Nate had tried anyway. He studied hard. He offered to help around the house. He kept his head down and his mouth shut. All he wanted was to belong. He had never asked for more. But now he realized the foundation of his world was built on sand. And it had just washed away. Upstairs in his room, Nate sat in the dark for hours. The textbooks remained in his backpack untouched. The lamp on his desk stayed off. He stared at the ceiling, the echo of his father's voice bouncing around in his skull like a cruel melody. "He's not your blood. He's not mine." The words weren't just sharp, they were final. He thought of all the moments he had mistaken for love. The times his father had shown up to parent-teacher meetings, always with a distant look. The birthdays where Brandon got a brand new bike and he got a "just be grateful" talk. The holidays where he was asked to take family photos but was never in them. He hadn't noticed it before. Or maybe he had and chose not to see it. And now it made too much sense. At breakfast the next morning, the kitchen was unusually quiet. Brandon sat at the table, spooning cereal into his mouth without looking at anyone. Nate sat across from him, staring at the same bowl of oatmeal he had been eating since childhood. It used to be his comfort food. Today it felt like glue. Linda brought over a glass of orange juice and placed it gently in front of Nate. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment too long. She knew. Had she heard him last night? He met her gaze, searching for something, confirmation, denial, anything. But she just smiled faintly and walked away to pour herself some coffee. Brandon snorted suddenly, breaking the silence. "Still playing the victim, huh?" Nate looked up, startled. "What? You heard them last night, didn't you?" Brandon didn't look up. His tone was casual, almost amused. "Finally figured it out." Nate said nothing. The silence was answer enough. Brandon leaned back in his chair, eyes meeting Nate's with something close to triumph. "Took you long enough. You're not one of us. Never were. Linda whipped her head around. Brandon. He shrugged. What? I'm just saying what everyone already knows. Nate pushed his chair back quietly. He didn't yell. He didn't throw the oatmeal. He just stood up, nodded once like something had been settled inside him, and walked out the door. The sun outside was too bright. The world kept spinning. He walked aimlessly through the suburban streets of Charlotte, North Carolina, his hands stuffed in his hoodie's pockets. Every face he passed belonged to someone who probably belonged somewhere. He passed the park where Linda used to take him as a kid. The corner store where he had bought popsicles with his allowance. The small library where he had once won a summer reading challenge and earned a certificate that Thomas had never even looked at. Memories. All built on a lie. But still, they were his. He touched his chest where his heart thumped steadily. His blood wasn't theirs. But it still beat for them. And somehow, he still loved them. That night, Nate returned home. Quietly. He went up to his room. He opened his biology textbook and started to study. His future, his identity, might have been unclear. But one thing remained certain. He knew who he was. Even if no one else did. Nate sat at his desk, the textbook pages lit by a soft desk lamp, but the words swam meaninglessly. The mitochondria, cellular respiration. Gene transcription, they used to make sense. They used to be his escape. But now every paragraph blurred into another, a haze clouded by a question he couldn't silence. Who am I really? He stared at the name written on the inside cover of his notebook, Nathaniel Harper. The last name felt foreign now. A borrowed title he had worn for 18 years like a second skin, believing it was his. But just like a piece of clothing, it could be stripped away. Brandon's words echoed again. You're not one of us. Never were. There had been cruelty in his voice, but more than that, relief. As if Brandon had waited for this day. Had hungered for Nate to finally realize the truth so he could finally be rid of the silent competition he had always resented. Nate ran a finger over the name and then slowly crossed out Harper with a single line. Not erased, just marked. Like a scar. Still visible. Still part of him, even if it no longer defined him. Later that night, Linda knocked on the door gently. Nate? He hesitated. Yeah. She opened the door but didn't step in. She looked smaller than usual, framed in the soft hallway light. Her nurse's uniform wrinkled from a long shift. There were shadows under her eyes, and her mouth pressed into a line, like she'd been rehearsing something for hours. I brought you something, she said, holding up a folded envelope. He took it silently, looking down at the worn paper. What is it? It's your adoption papers, she said quietly. I figured you had questions. And you deserve answers. Nate's fingers stiffened around the envelope. So it was true, no denial, no comforting lie. Just the facts. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked, not bitterly, just tired. Linda sat down on the edge of the bed. Her eyes glistened. I wanted to, she whispered. So many times. Especially when you were little, and you'd cry because Brandon wouldn't let you play with him. Or when Thomas refused to hang your drawings on the fridge. She paused, smiling faintly at the memory. But then you'd look at me with those big eyes, so full of love and trust, and I was scared. Scared you'd think we loved you any less. Nate looked down, his voice a murmur. Did you? She didn't hesitate. No. Never. You're my son, Nate. You always have been. The room fell silent, filled only by the quiet hum of the night outside. Nate looked at the envelope again, this fragile thing that held the truth of his existence. Do you know anything about my real mom? He asked. Linda reached into her pocket and pulled out a tiny locket. She handed it to him gently. She gave this to me in the hospital. Said it was the only thing she had left to pass on. She was in critical condition after the crash. You were 5. You had a gash across your cheek and kept asking for her. She held my hand and said, please don't let him grow up alone. Nate's throat closed up. He opened the locket. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman with bright eyes and a warm smile, eyes not unlike his own. On the other side, there was a tiny inscription, barely visible, to my Nathan. My heart. He blinked hard. She named me Nathaniel? Linda nodded. She called you Nate. Just like I do. That night, after Linda left, Nate didn't sleep. He sat by the window, holding the locket in one hand and the adoption papers in the other. It was strange how something could hurt so deeply, yet also bring clarity. The pain of not belonging was real, but so was the love he had received. It wasn't perfect love. It wasn't always fair. But it had still shaped who he was. 2 days later, Brandon stormed into the kitchen, throwing his car keys on the counter. "Who the hell scratched my car?" he barked. Nate looked up from his cereal calmly. "Probably a mirror you hit while checking yourself out." Brandon narrowed his eyes. "Don't get smart, bro. You think you can live here for free and mouth off." Nate met his glare without flinching. "I've been living here for 18 years. If you have a problem with that, take it up with your parents." Brandon smirked. "They're my parents, not yours. But I guess you're used to freeloading off people who pity you." Linda slammed down the dish she was washing. "Brandon, that's enough." Brandon didn't back down. "No, Mom. He's not my brother. He's not even family. Just some orphan you picked up like a project." That was when Thomas walked in, briefcase in hand. He looked exhausted. Like the weight of the entire family had finally caught up with him. "Brandon," he said sternly, not another word. Brandon froze, surprised by the authority in his father's voice. But Thomas didn't look at Nate, didn't apologize, didn't even acknowledge the argument. He simply walked to the coffee maker and began pouring himself a cup. Nate stood up, shoulders squared. "Don't worry, Brandon," he said, his voice even. "You win. I'm not your brother." Then, after a pause, he added quietly, "But you'll never be half the man I'm trying to be." And with that, he left the room. Outside, the sun had just begun to rise, painting the horizon in shades of gold and gray. Nate walked with purpose, but not to run away. Not anymore. He was Nathaniel. He wasn't a Harper by blood. But he was someone worth loving, even if no one else saw it yet. The summer air in Charlotte was warm, clinging, thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and distant pavement. Nate stood at the bus stop near their neighborhood, earbuds in, a canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. He had taken to walking and catching the bus to the university even though Brandon had a car and an extra seat. The idea of sitting next to him felt like punishment. But today, as he stepped onto the sidewalk, a familiar silver Toyota Camry pulled up beside him. The window rolled down. "Brandon, get in." "I'm heading that way." Nate raised an eyebrow. "You don't even know where I'm going." Brandon tapped the wheel with a smirk. "Don't need to. You live to go to school." "Let me guess, UNC." Nate hesitated. Brandon looked calm. But not mocking, not this time. There was a different energy in his voice. Still tinged with superiority, sure, but missing the usual sharp edge. Nate opened the passenger door slowly. "You offering a ride out of brotherly love?" he said, sarcastic but not cruel. Brandon shrugged. "Gas is cheaper than therapy." Nate climbed in, settling into the seat. The silence inside the car was dense, filled with unspoken words and years of tension. Brandon turned on the air conditioning and pulled away from the curb without another word. For the first 10 minutes, there was only the sound of the road, the low hum of the engine, and a sports radio station Brandon had probably forgotten to switch off. Then, out of nowhere, Brandon muttered, "You know I didn't ask for this either." Nate glanced sideways. "What? Driving me?" No, Brandon kept his eyes on the road. "You. In the family." It wasn't cruel the way he said it. Just honest. Raw. "I didn't ask to be there either," Nate replied. "I know," Brandon said. That alone surprised Nate more than any insult might have. Brandon knew? Since when had Brandon known anything about what Nate felt? "I used to hate how you were always perfect," Brandon continued. "Quiet. Smart. Helpful. Everyone loved you. Teachers, neighbors. Mom. Even Dad acted like he didn't hate you half the time. Meanwhile, I was always the screw-up." Nate stared ahead. "You were never the screw-up, Brandon. You just thought I was trying to be better than you." Brandon laughed under his breath, bitter. "Weren't you?" "No," Nate said, turning to face him. "I was just trying to be enough. For someone." Anyone. They reached a red light. Brandon's hands gripped the wheel tighter. I used to think you were replacing me, he admitted, voice barely audible. But now, I realize you were just trying to find a place that wasn't offered to you. Nate said nothing. The truth didn't need echoing. The light turned green. The car moved forward. But something inside Nate, inside both of them, had shifted. For the first time, there was no need for raised voices, or slamming doors, or biting sarcasm. There was simply understanding. And maybe that was enough for now. They reached the university. Brandon pulled up to the curb in front of the science building. Nate opened the door, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. Thanks for the ride. Brandon nodded. Don't get used to it. Nate smirked. Wouldn't dream of it. He stepped out and shut the door behind him. Brandon didn't drive off immediately. Nate turned to look back. Brandon rolled down the window again, hesitated, then said, Hey, you're not me. But that might not be a bad thing. Nate blinked. What does that mean? It means, Brandon muttered, you've got more guts than I ever gave you credit for. And with that, he sped off down the street. That evening, Nate found Linda in the backyard, watering her garden. Hey, he said, stepping onto the patio. She turned, surprised. You're home early. I caught a ride. With Brandon. Her eyes widened. Oh, yeah. He didn't try to throw me out of the car or anything. Progress. Linda chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. I told you. He just needed time. Time doesn't fix everything. No, she said, placing the watering can down. But people do. He sat beside her on the patio steps. The sun was setting, casting long orange streaks across the grass. I think he's trying, Nate said quietly. And what about you? I'm trying too. She reached over and touched his hand gently. You always have. Upstairs, in his room, Nate stared again at the locket and the envelope. This time, the weight of them didn't feel so heavy. He wasn't erasing who he was. He was growing into it. And maybe, just maybe, Brandon was too. The week passed without major friction, an unfamiliar calm in the Harper household. Brandon came and went from his part-time finance internship, barely speaking at dinner, but no longer baiting Nate with cutting remarks. Nate, for his part, avoided conflict, quietly navigating the emotional gray zone between old wounds and fragile peace. Still, something hung in the air between them. Unspoken. Uneasy. Then came Saturday. Thomas Harper stood at the doorway in a sharp gray blazer, adjusting his tie. Linda, I'll be back after the conference dinner, he called up the stairs. Try to make sure the boys don't kill each other. Linda poked her head down the hallway with a disapproving look. Maybe try saying goodbye like a human being, Tom. Thomas muttered something about traffic and closed the door behind him. Nate, seated at the kitchen island with his laptop, glanced up. Linda walked over with a folded grocery list and smiled. Could you do me a favor? She asked, sliding the paper toward him. Nate nodded. Sure. Brandon's heading to the market too. Maybe you two could go together. He hesitated. He knows that? Not yet, she said cheerfully. But you'll figure it out. A moment later, Brandon appeared, car keys in hand, clearly just having showered. Hey, Mom, I'm heading out. Need anything? Linda raised an eyebrow and gave him the same list. Brandon glanced at Nate, then back at her. You serious? Save gas. Be responsible adults. Share a car. You know Earth stuff. Brandon grumbled. But after a moment, he sighed. Fine. Nate shrugged. Okay by me. And just like that, they were out the door again, two brothers, or something like that. Shoved together by grocery errands and a very determined mother. The drive was quiet until halfway to the store. So, Brandon said, eyes on the road, how are classes? Nate blinked. Are you making small talk? I'm attempting to be less of a jackass. Just go with it. Nate smirked. They're fine. I've got a lot of labs this semester. Anatomy's brutal. You're still planning to go into medicine? Yeah. Brandon nodded slowly. That's good. You'll probably be amazing at it. Nate paused, surprised. Thanks. Another silence followed, but it was softer this time. No tension. No knives. At the store, They split up to handle the list faster. Nate was checking out cereal brands when he heard a familiar voice nearby. "Yo, Harper. Didn't think I'd see you here." Nate turned. It was Kyle, one of Brandon's frat buddies from Duke. Surrounded by two others. Loud. Arrogant. The type who always needed an audience. "Oh," Kyle added, spotting Nate. "You brought your, what's the word, roommate?" Brandon's jaw clenched. Nate pretended not to notice. Kyle grinned. "Still keeping the charity case around, huh? I thought he'd be off somewhere hugging trees and crying about saving whales." The guys laughed. Nate took a step back, his fists tightening slightly around the cereal box. He was used to these jabs. He'd survived them for years. But this time, for some reason, the shame didn't stick. It hit and slid off like rain on a windshield. Then Brandon surprised him. "That's enough," he said sharply. Kyle laughed. "What?" "I said that's enough." Brandon stepped forward, voice low but firm. "Nate's not a charity case. He's my brother. Say anything like that again and you'll be eating cereal through a straw." Kyle blinked, stunned. So was Nate. Brandon turned and walked toward the checkout line like nothing had happened. Nate followed in silence. In the car, they didn't speak for the first few minutes. The bags rustled in the back seat. The road stretched ahead. Then Nate finally said, "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to." "Why?" Brandon drummed his fingers on the wheel. "Because it turns out you don't need to share DNA to be my brother. You just needed to be the better man all along." Nate blinked fast, staring out the window to hide the way his chest tightened. They pulled into the driveway, the golden evening light washing the house in soft glow. Brandon shut off the engine but didn't move. "I know I was cruel," he said quietly. "Growing up, I saw you as the invader. Someone who could take everything, Dad's approval, Mom's affection, even the future I didn't know I wanted." He turned to Nate, voice thick. "But I get it now. You weren't here to replace me. You were just here to belong." Nate met his eyes. "I still want that," he said softly. "Even if I'm not your real brother." Brandon shook his head. "You are. Realer than I ever was." Then, in a move that surprised them both, he reached out and clumsily pulled Nate into a one-armed hug. It was awkward, brief, but real. And for Nate, that was enough. Later that night, Nate sat on his bed, the locket still in his hand. But now he placed it on his desk gently and pulled out a blank sheet of paper. At the top, he wrote, "Family isn't biology. It's choice. And sometimes, the people who hurt you the most are the same ones who need you the most." The rain came without warning. One moment, the sky was clear, warm with a late August sun. The next, clouds rolled in like silent giants, and the heavens opened up with a sudden, pounding force. The road gleamed under the assault, reflective and slick like polished stone. Brandon tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I told you we should have left earlier," Nate said, glancing nervously at the windshield as the wipers struggled against the torrent. "I did leave earlier. You just took forever saying goodbye to Mom." "It's called being polite. It's called being dramatic," Brandon muttered, smirking. They were on their way back to Chapel Hill after a weekend home. The car was filled with snacks from Linda, plastic containers of home-cooked food, and the warm quiet that had begun settling between them in recent weeks, something almost like comfort. Almost like peace. But peace is fragile. And life doesn't always wait. As they rounded the curve on I-85, headlights blazed in front of them. A truck skidding across lanes. Horns. Screeching tires. "Brandon!" Nate shouted. Time slowed. Brandon jerked the wheel instinctively, but the reins stole their traction. The Camry spun, hydroplaning, a deafening chorus of metal, glass, and panic erupting as the world turned sideways. Impact. A sudden, violent jolt slammed them forward. Nate's head hit the window. Airbags exploded like thunder. Glass shattered. The food in the backseat flew forward like shrapnel. The noise was too loud. Then instantly gone. Silence. Then pain. Blinding, everywhere pain. When Nate opened his eyes, everything was blurred and bright, emergency lights flashing through rain-smeared glass. A siren wailed somewhere distant. His chest burned. His hands trembled. "Brandon," he croaked, twisting painfully to the driver's seat. Brandon was slumped forward, unmoving. Blood traced a slow line down the side of his face, and his breaths came shallow and irregular. "Brandon!" Nate shouted, fumbling with his seatbelt. He reached over, shaking his brother's shoulder. "Stay with me, hey, come on." Brandon's eyes fluttered, just barely. "Hurts," he whispered. "Don't talk," Nate said, his voice cracking. "You're okay. We're okay. Help's coming." Then he saw it. Brandon's abdomen was bleeding. A lot. The sharp edge of the steering wheel had pierced his side. It was bad. Too bad. The ER was chaos. Linda burst through the hospital doors. Eyes wild, her nurse's badge still clipped to her shirt, her hair soaked from the rain. She spotted Nate, sitting in a wheelchair outside the trauma room, and 4 in one arm, a bandage on his temple. His hoodie was soaked through with blood. Brandon's. She dropped to her knees in front of him. "Are you okay?" "Oh my God, baby." "I'm fine," he whispered hoarsely. "I'm okay. Where's Brandon?" He looked toward the double doors. "They're trying. But his liver. It's ruptured. They said if he doesn't get a transplant within the hour." He trailed off. Linda's face went pale. Then Nate said, "I'll do it." "What?" "I'll donate part of mine. We share a blood type. I checked years ago." "No, Nate. I have to, Mom." His voice was firm. "You said love wasn't about biology, right? Then don't stop me now." Linda hesitated for one heartbeat. Then she nodded. And everything moved fast. Tests. Consent forms. A rush of cold down his spine as nurses prepped him. A quiet moment with Linda holding his hand while he lay in a pre-op bed, eyes fluttering with fear and determination. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "You've always been my son. But today, you're my hero too." Nate smiled faintly as the anesthesia took hold. Hours passed. Thomas arrived at the hospital with hollow eyes. When Linda told him what Nate had done, he sat down wordlessly, head in his hands. In the recovery room, Nate woke slowly, disoriented. His side ached sharply, but his mind cleared with one question. "Brandon?" he asked. Linda nodded. Tears in her eyes. "Stable. He's going to make it." Nate exhaled a shaky breath and closed his eyes. In another wing of the hospital, Brandon opened his eyes. His chest was tight. His throat burned. But he was alive. And the first thing he saw was his mother's tear-streaked face. "Where's Nate?" he rasped. Linda smiled gently. "Down the hall. Resting. You're here because of him." Brandon swallowed hard. He didn't remember much. Just the crash. Pain. His brother screaming his name. And now this quiet room full of machines and second chances. He turned his face toward the window, tears welling unexpectedly. For the first time in his life, he truly felt small. And loved. By someone he didn't deserve. But someone who chose him anyway. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor blended into the sterile quiet of the hospital room. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting striped shadows across Brandon's bed. His eyes fluttered open for the 3rd time since surgery, this time longer. Clearer. His chest was still tight, his side numb and wrapped in layers of gauze and tape. But he was alive. And he knew why. The door creaked open. Nate stepped inside, slowly. He moved gingerly, one arm tucked around his own abdomen where fresh sutures lay hidden beneath hospital cotton. He looked pale. A little thinner than before, but he walked tall. Brandon blinked, unsure what to say. Then Nate broke the silence first. "I brought your favorite juice." He held up a plastic bottle of orange mango, the one Brandon used to chug during high school finals. Brandon let out a rough, dry chuckle. "Still remember that, huh?" Nate shrugged, settling into the chair beside the bed. "You're not that hard to read. You've always been an orange mango and ego kind of guy." Brandon cracked a faint smile. "You look like hell." "Speak for yourself," Nate said, grinning. Silence fell between them again, but this time, it wasn't loaded. It was comfortable. For a moment. Then Brandon's gaze dropped. "Why?" he asked hoarsely. "Why would you do that for me?" Nate leaned back in the chair, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his stitches. Because he said slowly, "You're my brother." Brandon stared at him, eyes wide. "Even after the way I treated you?" Nate nodded. "Especially after that." Brandon looked away, jaw clenched. "You should hate me." "I did," Nate admitted. "Sometimes. Other times I just wished you'd see me." Brandon's throat tightened. "I saw you. I just didn't want to." He looked back at Nate, his eyes suddenly wet. "I was angry that Mom loved you. I was scared you'd take everything. And when I found out you weren't one of us, I used that like a weapon." "I know," Nate said gently. "You threw it like a punch. Every time you could." "I thought it would keep me above you," Brandon whispered. "But it just made me smaller." The air grew thick. Both of them sat in silence, heavy with words long overdue. Then, in a voice barely louder than a breath, Brandon said, "I don't deserve what you did." "That's not your call to make." Brandon looked at him. For a long moment, neither blinked. Then, his voice breaking at the edges, Brandon reached out a shaky hand. "Nate." Nate's eyes met his. "Thank you." Nate grasped his hand. "You're welcome." Brandon swallowed. "You didn't just give me part of your liver, man. You gave me a second chance." Nate blinked fast, but said nothing. Then Brandon added, and for the record. He paused, steadying his voice. "You're my brother. I mean it." The words landed like thunder, and yet as soft as falling rain. Nate tried to speak, but his voice caught. So he nodded. One simple, powerful nod. And in that moment, something finally clicked into place, something they had both longed for but never believed would come. Acceptance. Recognition. Family. Later that day, Linda walked in on them watching an old college football game on Brandon's laptop. Brandon was sipping the orange mango juice. Nate was curled sideways in the recliner, half asleep. She stopped in the doorway, her hand pressed against her chest. "You boys okay?" she asked. Brandon nodded. "We're good, Mom." Then he looked at Nate and added, "My brother's got the constitution of a tank." Linda blinked in surprise and smiled through tears. That night, alone in his room, Nate took out the adoption envelope one more time. He didn't cry this time. He didn't stare at it like a mystery needing solving. Instead, he reached for a pen and crossed out something on the front. Not the word adoption. Not his name. But the question mark he had scribbled next to Harper the night he first opened it. In its place, he wrote a single word. Brother. The hospital hallways were quieter now. Brandon had been moved out of ICU to a private recovery room, and Nate, still weak, but healing, was cleared for discharge. Linda had insisted he spend another day resting before returning to campus. She wanted to keep him close, at least for one more night. So Nate sat in a wheelchair beside a wall of windows, watching cars pass by on the street below. A gentle breeze crept through the slightly cracked glass, carrying in the smell of rain-soaked concrete and blooming dogwoods. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He felt, still, whole, in a way he hadn't expected. He didn't hear the footsteps until they stopped behind him. Nate. The voice was low, familiar, measured. He turned slowly. Thomas Harper. Pressed slacks. A navy blazer. Neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard. And the usual guarded expression. But something in his eyes was different today. "Hey," Nate said, not quite smiling. Not quite cold. Thomas nodded. "Can we talk?" Nate gestured to the empty bench across from him. "Sure." Thomas sat slowly, hands clasped. Eyes focused on some invisible point on the floor between them. "I heard you were going home tomorrow," he said. "That's the plan." Thomas nodded again. Silence stretched. Nate waited. He wasn't going to fill it this time. Not like every other time, when he had tried to impress, to connect, to earn even a crumb of fatherly approval. This time, it had to come from him. And, at last, it did. "I never knew how to talk to you," Thomas said, voice softer now. "I was afraid, I think, of what it would mean to admit you belonged." Nate blinked, surprised by the honesty. Thomas looked up. "Brandon was my blood. My first. I knew what to do with him, even when I did it wrong. But you. You showed up one day, 5 years old, wide-eyed, and already carrying more loss than a child should. He paused. And Linda, she loved you instantly. It scared me. Nate frowned. Because I wasn't yours? Thomas nodded slowly. Because I was afraid I couldn't be enough. That I wouldn't feel it. That I'd always be pretending. And did you? Thomas took a breath. At first, maybe. But then, I saw the way you looked at me like I was already your father. No questions. No expectations. Just hope. His voice cracked. Just a little. And still, I kept you at arm's length. I told myself it was for Brandon's sake. For balance. But the truth is, I didn't want to love you halfway. So I convinced myself not to love you at all. Nate stared at him, the words landing slowly. Like light rain on dry soil. You know, Nate said quietly, I wasn't waiting for you to be perfect. I was just waiting for you to show up. Thomas looked at him. And for the first time in Nate's life, his father's eyes shimmered. I showed up too late, he whispered. No, Nate replied. You showed up now. And that mattered more. Thomas reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small folded photo. Linda found this in an old drawer. She said you'd want it. He handed it over. Nate opened it. It was a photo from years ago. Maybe he was 6. Sitting on Thomas's shoulders at the local fair. Both of them smiling, ice cream smeared across Nate's cheeks. He stared at it for a long time. I don't even remember this. I do, Thomas said. It's the only time you called me Dad without hesitation. Nate looked up. Do you still want me to? Thomas swallowed hard. Then nodded. If you want to, he added. I'd like that very much. Nate folded the photo carefully, slipping it into his jacket pocket. Okay, Dad. And for the first time, the word felt true. Not forced. Not borrowed. But chosen. Earned. Thomas stood slowly. You need anything for tomorrow? I can drive you back to school. I think Brandon wants to, Nate said with a small smile. I think he's trying to make up for a decade in one weekend. Thomas chuckled. He'll try. But he's still your brother. He'll mess it up. Nate stood too. That's the plan. Thomas reached out. And after a heartbeat of hesitation, placed a hand on Nate's shoulder. Firm. Gentle. There. Not as a gesture of obligation, but as a father. That evening, Nate lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought of the crash, the surgery, the conversation with Brandon, and now, the moment with Thomas. He had been searching for roots, and somehow, in the aftermath of breaking, something new had grown. Not blood, not name, but choice. Love that chose him back. The Harper home had never felt particularly warm to Nate. For most of his life, it had been a place of quiet walking on eggshells, of muted dinners and careful smiles. The family portraits in the hallway were always missing one face, his. The laughter he heard was rarely his to join. But today, when he stepped through the front door, everything felt different. Not because the furniture had changed, or the family dynamic had suddenly become perfect, but because for the first time, Nate wasn't questioning whether he was welcome here. He knew he was. Don't just stand there. Linda called from the kitchen. You're home, not at a museum. Take off your shoes. Nate smiled. Yes, ma'am. Brandon followed behind him, walking with a noticeable limp and one arm still wrapped from surgery. Pretty sure she said the same thing to me 10 years ago, and I still ignored her. Linda appeared in the doorway holding a tray of lemonade. And I still haven't forgiven you for it. Brandon laughed, easing himself down onto the couch. You know, Mom. Guilt trips work best when the victim isn't literally fresh out of surgery. Oh, you're fine. You're just milking it now. Why else have a liver if not to milk it for sympathy? Brandon replied with a wink at Nate. They all laughed. Even Thomas, who had just walked in with a stack of mail, cracked a smile. He handed Nate a small envelope. From the university. Might be your tuition statement. Nate opened it without thinking. But inside, instead of an invoice, there was a note. To Mr. Nathaniel Harper. Due to your recent medical donation and outstanding academic record, we are pleased to inform you that you've been awarded the Campus Humanitarian Grant for the remainder of your undergraduate degree. We thank you for being an example of selflessness and character. UNC Financial Aid Office. Nate blinked. It's a full scholarship, he said in disbelief. Linda clapped her hands over her mouth. Thomas adjusted his glasses, a rare pride in his tone. You earned that. Brandon gave a mock scowl. You save one sibling's life and suddenly you're a campus legend. Unbelievable. Nate looked at him. You'd have done the same. Brandon raised an eyebrow. Let's not get carried away. But his smirk couldn't hide the truth behind the joke. Nate headed to the kitchen to grab a drink, leaving his family in the living room. As he opened the fridge, he paused at the sight of something taped to its surface. It was a photograph. The same one Thomas had given him in the hospital, Nate at 6 years old. Perched on Thomas's shoulders at the fair. Underneath it, someone, probably Linda, had written in black marker. Our boys. There was no asterisk. No disclaimer. No separation. Just ours. Nate stared at the photo, then slowly reached for a magnet from the drawer. He pressed it down firmly, making sure the picture stayed. He heard footsteps behind him. Brandon leaned against the counter. Hey, so, that scholarship. Pretty convenient. Now you can afford to take care of me when I'm old and decrepit. You mean next week? Brandon snorted. Fair. A beat passed. Then Brandon grew quiet. You scared me, you know. At the hospital. Seeing you on that table. I was scared too, Nate admitted. Not of the surgery. Just of losing the chance to fix things. You didn't have to fix anything, Brandon said. That was on me. Nate shrugged. We both had parts. Brandon looked at him. Then, almost awkwardly, he extended his arms. Nate stepped into the hug. It wasn't stiff this time. It lingered. Honest. Full. You're my brother, Brandon whispered. For real. Forever. I know. Nate replied. That night, they sat around the dinner table as a family. Thomas led grace, something he rarely did, and when he finished, he added, I'm grateful for second chances. No one said much after that. But no one needed to. Because in the laughter that followed, the shared memories, the jokes, the terrible imitations of each other's voices, something bloomed. Not perfection. Not erasure of the past. But healing. The kind that comes slowly, unevenly, and through love that chooses to stay. Later, alone in his room, Nate stared at the ceiling. The shadows were soft. His heart beat steady. He wasn't defined by blood. Or adoption papers. Or years of silence. He was defined by what he had given. And what they had finally given back. A place. A name. A family. The red brick buildings of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill glowed in the early autumn sun. Students buzzed around campus with backpacks and coffee cups, calling to each other across the quad. Somewhere, someone strummed a guitar. The familiar scent of paper, pine, and brewing espresso drifted through the air. Nate stepped off the bus and stood still for a moment, just breathing. He'd walked this path 100 times. Same sidewalks. Same science building. Same cafeteria that always overcooked the eggs. But this time, he was different. He rolled his suitcase toward the dorm building with slower steps than usual. Not from pain, though his side still ached if he moved too quickly, but because he was no longer walking like someone invisible. No longer shrinking into his clothes. Waiting to prove his worth to people who already saw him. For the first time in his life, Nate didn't feel like he had something to hide. Inside the dorm. His roommate Leo, an art student with wild hair and a love for sketching everyone's shoes, looked up from his sketch pad when Nate walked in. Holy crap, Leo said. You're alive. Still debating. Nate said with a grin. Leo jumped up and gave him a gentle half-hug. Man, when they said you were in surgery, I thought, dude, I'm glad you're okay. Yeah, it was intense. Leo gestured to Nate's duffel. Want help unpacking? Nah, Nate replied, sitting on the edge of his bed. I kind of like doing it slow this time. Leo nodded, then grabbed his sketch pad again. By the way, you're kind of famous now. Nate blinked. Excuse me? Campus Instagram page posted something about you. Student saves life of adopted brother in emergency liver transplant. #brother goals. You're practically a Hallmark movie. Nate groaned, laughing. Please tell me they didn't use my high school photo. Leo flipped his sketchpad around. He'd drawn it, Nate. Eyes closed, arm raised dramatically like some sort of saint. Kill me, Nate muttered. Leo grinned. I'll start with your liver. Oh, wait, already donated. They both burst out laughing. Later that evening, Nate walked alone to the small hill near the biology building, the one spot on campus where the trees dipped into a perfect golden arch in fall. He used to sit here when he felt lost. When he missed a family he wasn't sure was truly his. Now he sat in peace. He pulled out his notebook and opened to a fresh page. At the top, he wrote, "What does it mean to belong?" He stared at the words for a moment. Then, underneath, wrote, "Maybe it's not where you start, or even who you came from. Maybe it's who stands beside you when you fall. Maybe it's who sees you, even when you're trying to disappear. Maybe it's the ones who stay." He smiled softly and flipped the page. Back in his dorm that night, Nate's phone buzzed. A video call from Brandon. He answered. Brandon's face appeared, still a bit pale, but sitting up in bed, wearing one of their old high school t-shirts. "What's up, legend?" Brandon said. "Don't start. Too late. I already ordered a custom mug that says, 'My brother gave me his liver and all I got was this lousy gratitude.'" Nate rolled his eyes. "Please tell me you're kidding." "Nope. It's arriving Thursday. I'll send you one too." They both laughed. Then Brandon's voice lowered. "Seriously. I just wanted to check in. See how you're settling back in." "I'm okay," Nate said honestly. "More than okay." Brandon nodded. "Good." There was a pause. Then Brandon added, I never really told you the whole truth." Nate frowned. "About what?" "The day of the crash. When I saw the truck, I didn't think about myself. I looked at you. And I thought, if he dies, I'll never get to fix what I broke." Nate's voice was quiet. "You didn't need to fix it. We built something better." Brandon smiled. "Yeah, we did." A long silence followed, not awkward, but steady. Whole. Then Brandon grinned again. "Okay, I gotta go. Mom's coming in with soup. She's convinced I can't survive unless I'm drowning in chicken broth." "Sounds accurate." "Shut up. Talk soon." "Yeah, talk soon." The call ended. Nate stared at the screen for a moment longer, then set the phone down. In the quiet, he listened, not to the past, not to the old voices of not being enough, but to the beat of something new. Not perfect, not simple, but his. A life made from choice. A brother earned. A family found. And a heart, still healing, but finally at peace. The auditorium was packed. More than 300 students filled the rows, some leaning forward with phones poised to record, others whispering quietly. The campus held its annual Voices of Courage event, a platform where students nominated their peers to share stories of strength, pain, and resilience. Nate hadn't signed up. He wouldn't have dared. But Leo had. And apparently, Leo was very persuasive. When Nate found out he'd been nominated and selected, he nearly said no. The thought of standing under that spotlight, of revealing not just facts but feelings, made his heart beat in all the wrong ways. But now, standing behind the velvet curtain as a student MC read out his name, Nate realized something. He wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. The applause greeted him as he stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. His palms were cold, but steady. He looked out at the faces in front of him, some familiar, most not, and then up at the rafters, where a soft beam of light spilled down, warming his shoulders. He took a breath and began. "Hi, I'm Nathaniel Harper. But for a long time, I wasn't sure if I had the right to that name." The room quieted instantly. "I grew up in a house where I didn't quite match the furniture, or the photo frames, or the last names etched on trophies. I was told, eventually, bluntly, that I wasn't born into the family I called mine. That knowledge hurt. Not because it changed the past, but because it explained it. All the ways I felt, unseen, uninvited." He paused. And then, something happened. "My brother, the one who used to call me not real, was in a car accident. He almost died. And I chose to give him part of my liver." There were audible gasps across the room. People asked why. Why save someone who'd never made room for you? He looked around slowly, locking eyes with a few students. The answer is simple. Because I loved him anyway. And because love doesn't have to wait for permission. The silence in the room deepened. After that, he called me his brother. For the first time in 18 years. And I realized something: belonging isn't something that's given. It's claimed. It's built. Nate took a steadying breath. I'm not the sum of my DNA. I'm not the boy left behind in a hospital. I'm not the outsider at the dinner table. I'm the brother who stayed. The son who loved. The man who gave, because that's who I want to be. He leaned forward slightly. So yeah, I'm Nathaniel Harper. And I'm not ashamed to carry that name. He paused. Because I earned it. The auditorium exploded in applause. But Nate didn't flinch or smile right away. He just stood there finally, fully, without shrinking. Backstage, Leo wrapped him in a hug so tight it made Nate's stitches ache. You killed it, man. I didn't want to cry on stage, Nate muttered, wiping his eyes. Dude, half the front row was crying for you. Back in the crowd, Linda was on her feet, clapping furiously, cheeks wet with tears. Brandon sat beside her in a hoodie and jeans, trying and failing to look unaffected. Thomas stood behind them. Quiet but proud, his arms crossed. He said nothing, but his eyes never left Nate. That night, back at the dorm, Nate opened his email to find dozens of messages. Subject: thank you. Subject: you helped me speak. Subject: I've felt that too. He scrolled through the notes. From strangers. Students who had been adopted, who had lived in foster care, who had never felt like they belonged in their own families. He read them all, and replied to every single one. Because if there was one thing he had learned, it was this. Sometimes, healing doesn't come in big moments, but in quiet truths bravely shared. Later, he lay in bed, the night humming outside, the world still moving. And he smiled. Not because everything was perfect now, but because, finally, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The sun filtered gently through the blinds of Nate's dorm room, brushing over the organized stacks of books and the neatly folded hoodie that still smelled faintly like home. Nate stood by the window, coffee mug in hand, staring out across campus. Students streamed between classes, backpacks slung, earbuds in, worlds of their own. He had never felt more seen in his life. And strangely, it scared him. His inbox had flooded since the speech. Messages from strangers. Professors thanking him for speaking up. One girl from Colorado had written, I'm not adopted, but I've never felt like I belonged anywhere either. Your words felt like mine. Thank you. He'd read that 3 times. Still, something buzzed beneath it all. An edge of pressure. Of expectation. Because when people start calling you brave, it becomes harder to admit you're still figuring things out. Leo stumbled in, balancing 2 iced lattes and a paper bag. Bro, you need to sit down. I am sitting, Nate said, raising an eyebrow. Mentally, I mean. He tossed the bag on the desk and opened his phone, thrusting it toward Nate. Local hero speaks out on chosen family. Nate Harper's speech goes viral. Published by WRAL News, Raleigh. Nate blinked. What? They picked it up, Leo said, grinning. Your speech. Someone filmed it. Posted it on TikTok. Now it's on the news site. The news, man. Nate grabbed the phone and scrolled through the article. His photo was there mid-sentence, brows slightly furrowed, lips parted. The caption read, Student gives liver to adoptive brother, redefines what it means to belong. Leo said it again, you went viral. Nate didn't respond right away. His heart pounded faster than it had during the actual speech. So, here's the real kicker, Leo added. Check your email. You got an interview request. A live one. State television. Nate swallowed. Sure enough, there it was in his inbox. From Megan Ellis, WRAL morning segment producer. Subject, interview invitation, Nate Harper. Dear Nate, we were incredibly moved by your speech during UNC's Voices of Courage event. Your story has touched thousands and continues to resonate across North Carolina and beyond. We would be honored to invite you to join us for a live segment on Carolina Mornings this Thursday. We'd love for you to share your journey and message of healing with our viewers. Please let us know if you're open to it. Warmly, Megan Ellis. Leo whistled. This is it, man. You've got a voice now. A real one. Nate set the phone down slowly. I don't know. What do you mean? I don't know? You stood in front of a crowd and broke hearts with your words. You think you don't belong on camera after that? Nate ran a hand through his hair. It's different. In that room, I could see the people. It was personal. But this? It's cameras and strangers and questions I don't even know how to answer yet. Leo quieted. Then maybe that's exactly why you should do it. Nate glanced at him. You're not pretending to be a perfect person with a perfect message, Leo said gently. You're a guy who gave something of himself, literally and emotionally, and now people are listening. So say what's true. That's enough. That evening, Nate FaceTimed home. Brandon picked up first, lounging on the couch with a blanket thrown over one shoulder. What's up, superstar? Did you see the article? Nate asked. Oh yeah, Dad printed it and laminated it. I think he's going to hang it in the garage. Nate laughed, but then added, they invited me for a live interview. On TV. Brandon raised an eyebrow. You nervous? Terrified? Then do it. Brandon said simply. You've already done scarier things. Like saving my life. Or letting me live with you after I made high school a living hell. You were bad, Nate admitted. But not unfixable. Brandon leaned forward, serious now. Let me know if you want me there. I'll come with you. Nate blinked. Really? I've never been on TV before, Brandon said, pretending to stretch dramatically. Might as well ride your coattails into redemption arc fame. Nate smiled, but quietly, his chest filled with warmth. Not because Brandon joked, but because Brandon offered. Later that night, Nate sat alone at his desk, staring at the interview email. He thought of the name Harper. How it used to feel like a name borrowed from someone else's mailbox. Now, it felt earned. He hit reply. Hi Megan. Thank you so much for the kind words. I'd be honored to share my story. I'll be there Thursday. Warmly, Nate Harper. He clicked send. Then leaned back, heart still pounding but lighter. He didn't know how the interview would go. But for once, he wasn't doing it to prove anything. He was doing it to speak the truth. The next few days moved in quiet, careful ripples. Nate spent his time between classes, finishing assignments and fielding an endless stream of well-meaning messages. Professors nodded at him in hallways. A group of pre-med students asked him to speak at a mentorship night. One girl slipped a note under his dorm door that simply read, You gave me courage to go home again. He smiled at that one for a long time. The WRAL interview was scheduled for Thursday morning. Leo had already picked out Nate's outfit clean, simple, hero who doesn't know he's a hero vibes. According to him, Brandon would be meeting him at the station. Linda had texted a dozen reminders about hydration, hair gel, and posture. Thomas sent a thumbs-up emoji. It somehow meant more than any long speech. But on Wednesday night, something shifted. Nate was sitting on his bed, headphones on, reviewing his old anatomy notes when his phone buzzed with a notification from an unknown number. Unknown number. Hi. I hope this isn't too sudden. My name is Elise Morales. I believe I'm your cousin. On your birth mother's side. I saw your speech online. If you're open to it, I'd really like to talk. Nate stared at the screen, not blinking. He read it again. And again. Cousin. Birth mother's side. He lowered the phone slowly, pulse hammering in his ears. For years, he had imagined fragments. A hand brushing hair back. A lullaby hummed in Spanish. A woman in a hospital bed whispering his name. But they were dreams. Untethered. Now a thread was forming. A voice from that other life. The one before the Harpers. The one before he even knew there was a before. He stared at the phone for a long time. Then carefully typed. Hi Elise. I wasn't expecting this. But I'm open to talking. What do you know about her? He hesitated. Then hit send. It took a few minutes before the reply came. Elise Morales. I was young when it all happened. But I remember your mom, Camila. She was my aunt. Bright, funny, stubborn. She loved you so fiercely. We lost touch with everything after the accident. I only found out what happened a few years ago. When I saw your story, I recognized the locket in the photo. I remember that locket. She wore it every day. Nate's throat tightened. I still have it, he typed back. It's all I had from her for a long time. Another message came. Elise Morales. Would you ever want to meet? No pressure. Just, if it feels right. Nate stared at that question. It sat there like a mirror. Would he? He closed the chat window. Not replying. Not yet. Instead, he opened his drawer and pulled out the locket. The tiny photo inside was fading, edges curling slightly from time. He turned it over. Ran his thumb over the tiny engraved words. To my Nathan. My heart. For the first time, he wondered what Camila would say if she saw him now. Would she be proud? Would she feel like he turned out okay, even after everything? The next morning, Brandon picked him up in the same silver Camry they'd almost died in. It had been repaired, but the faint dent in the dashboard was still there, like a scar that refused to vanish. You look like you haven't slept, Brandon said as Nate slid in. I didn't. Interview nerves? Nate hesitated. Someone reached out. From my birth mom's family. Brandon glanced over. Seriously? Yeah. A cousin. Elise. She saw the video. What do you want to do about it? I don't know. Brandon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, well, whatever you decide, you're still my brother. Not losing you to some Morales clan. Not happening. Nate smiled faintly. You're territorial. Damn right. At the studio, makeup was minimal. Lighting blinding. The green room was colder than expected. Nate fidgeted in the waiting chair. Brandon nearby pretending to scroll his phone but clearly watching him. Megan, the producer, came in with a calm voice and kind smile. You ready? She asked. I think so. Good. Because you're going live in 3 minutes. Nate followed her to the stage. The host, a warm middle-aged man with an easy smile, greeted him with a handshake and a quick mic check. Then came the countdown. 3, 2, 1. The light turned red, and the world began listening. Today, we're joined by Nathaniel Harper, a pre-med student from UNC whose story of sacrifice and healing has touched people all across the country. Nate smiled politely, heart-thudding. Thank you for being here, Nate. Thank you for having me. The host leaned forward. So, you gave part of your liver to your brother. That's not something most 18-year-olds are thinking about. Nate breathed in. And then, like he'd done before, but with a bit more weight and a bit more certainty, he told the truth. About Brandon. About what it meant to love without condition. About belonging. And yes, about not sharing DNA, but sharing something more powerful, choice. The host asked him, have you heard from your birth family since all this came out? Nate hesitated. I have. He said quietly. Someone reached out just yesterday. It's new. I'm not sure what will come of it, but I think I'm ready to know. And your message to others who feel like they don't belong? Nate looked directly into the camera. I used to think family was something you were born into, but now I know it's something you build. With forgiveness, with truth, with love. Even when it's messy. Especially when it's messy. The host smiled. Well said. And then it was over. Backstage, Brandon hugged him tight. You nailed it. Nate smiled. Yeah. You're still a nerd. But now you're a nerd who's gonna end up in someone's inspirational TikTok montage. Nate laughed, full and real. But inside, he thought about Elise. About Camila. About the name Morales. And he knew the next step was coming. Not to erase the name Harper, but to honor both. The coffee shop was tucked on a quiet street in Durham, just far enough from campus to feel like neutral ground. A small, leafy patio. Warm wood floors. Sunlight filtered through ivy-covered windows. The kind of place people went to speak softly and mean what they said. Nate sat at a corner table by the window, his hands wrapped around a warm mug he hadn't touched. His foot bounced beneath the table, nerves coiling in his stomach like thread. Across from him sat a stranger. A young woman in her late 20s, maybe 30, with chestnut brown hair pulled back into a low ponytail. She wore a faded jean jacket, silver hoops, and a pendant necklace that glinted every time she moved. Elise Morales. She looked like she had rehearsed this moment 100 times. Nate hadn't rehearsed at all. "I didn't know what to bring," she said softly. "So I just brought memories." Nate nodded. "That's probably more than I've had my whole life." Elise opened her purse and pulled out a small photo album, the old-school kind with plastic sleeves and peeling corners. She hated taking pictures. Elise said with a smile. "Always said she didn't want to be remembered for her bad hair days. But I found a few. From before." Nate leaned in. The first photo was of a group gathered around a backyard grill. Children running barefoot. Adults holding plates and laughing. One woman stood out, not in the center, but near the edge, holding a red plastic cup and laughing so hard her eyes were nearly closed. She looked familiar. Something in the shape of her mouth. Her posture. The curve of her hand. "That's her?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Elise nodded. "Camila." Nate swallowed. The name felt like a sigh. A breeze from another life. "She was my favorite aunt," Elise said. "When I was 6, she taught me how to draw butterflies. I used to beg to sleep over at her apartment. She worked late but always made time for me. And when she got pregnant with you," Elise paused, smiling sadly. "She was so excited. Scared, but all in." Nate listened without interrupting. His eyes locked on the image, like if he blinked she might disappear. "She was working 2 jobs," Elise continued. "Your dad wasn't around. She never said much about him, just that she didn't want you to grow up chasing ghosts." Nate looked up. "Do you know who he was?" Elise hesitated. "I only know a name. Raphael. He was gone before you were born. That's all Camila ever told us. She didn't want him to have power over your future." Nate nodded slowly. There was no bitterness in him. Just a quiet ache. "She didn't leave anything behind," he said. "Just a locket." Elise pulled something else from her bag, an envelope, yellowed at the corners. "This," she said, "was in my grandmother's attic. Camila wrote it after she gave birth. She must have mailed a copy to our grandma. I found it last year." She slid it across the table. Nate stared at the handwriting. Loopy. Rushed. Young. He opened it carefully. "Dear Nate, you are not even a day old, and already I can feel the whole world inside you. I don't know what life will give us. I don't know how long I'll be here to guide you. But I want you to know this. You were wanted. You were chosen. Every breath I take, every dollar I earn, every tear I cry, it's for you. One day, if something happens to me and you end up with someone else, please remember this. I never gave you up. I gave you forward. I gave you to love. Love, always. Mom." Nate pressed the letter to his chest, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. Elise said nothing. She didn't try to fill the silence. She just let him feel it. When he finally looked up, tears blurred his vision. "She didn't give me up," he whispered. "She gave me forward." Elise reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "She would have been proud of you," she said. "Not because of the interview. Not even because of the liver thing. Just because of the kind of man you are." Nate nodded slowly, overwhelmed but grounded. "Would you want to come to dinner?" Elise asked. "Meet some of the others? There's a lot of us. Loud. Messy. Big hearts. No pressure." Nate smiled through his tears. "Yeah, I think I'd like that. Later." Walking back through the city streets, Nate felt like something had been stitched closed in him. Not covered up. Not forgotten. But healed. He still had questions. He probably always would. But now, he had a story. Not just of abandonment, but of love. Lost. Broken. And still reaching for him, even across time. That night, he sat in bed and wrote in his notebook again. "She didn't leave me. She launched me. And even though I didn't grow up with her arms around me, her words found me in the end." The Morales family home stood on a quiet street in Raleigh, shaded by old oaks and dotted with pink camellias. The house wasn't large, but it breathed history, worn steps, a wind chime that tinkled above the door, and laughter that leaked from the windows before Nate even reached the porch. He paused at the gate, his palms damp. His stomach fluttered with the same nervous energy he'd felt before his first high school presentation. Except this wasn't a presentation. There were no bullet points here. No practice lines. Just a door and the people behind it. He took a breath. Then, with one steady hand, he knocked. It opened almost immediately. "Nate?" Elise beamed, her eyes instantly softening. "You came." "Hi," he said, voice smaller than he intended. "Hope I'm not late." "Right on time," she said. "Come in. We've been stalking the window for 20 minutes. She stepped aside, and he crossed the threshold. Inside was noise, color, smell, sofrito on the stove, old salsa playing from a speaker in the corner, a dozen voices overlapping, and then, suddenly, silence. All heads turned. A woman with streaks of silver in her dark hair stepped forward, drying her hands on a dish towel. Her eyes locked on Nate's, and something passed through them, recognition, awe, grief, joy, all tangled together. "You look like her," she whispered. Nate swallowed. "You knew Camila?" "I'm her sister," the woman said. "I'm Letitia. Your aunt." Before he could answer, she pulled him into a fierce, full-bodied hug. Nate stiffened for a heartbeat, then melted into it. He hadn't been held like this in years. Not by someone who felt his history without needing an explanation. Behind her, people stepped forward, one by one. "Carlos. Your cousin. Abuela Maria. She's 92. Still smarter than the rest of us combined. I'm Javier. I remember holding you when you were a baby." Names. Faces. Smiles. A warm, wrinkled hand reached out and touched his cheek. "Mi niño," the old woman said. "You made it home." He didn't understand all her words, but he understood the meaning. He had made it home. Dinner was loud and chaotic. There was arroz con pollo, fried plantains, sweet pastries, and a pot of flan no one was allowed to touch until the stories were told. They asked Nate everything. What he studied. What music he liked. Whether Brandon was cute or just a little pendejo with a redemption arc. He laughed so hard at that, he nearly choked on his rice. Then came the stories about Camila. She once punched a guy in the nose for calling her baby mama, Letitia said, grinning. She painted murals on the daycare walls for free because they had no budget, Javier added. She had this whistle, Abuela said. When she blew it, even the dogs sat down. They all laughed, and Nate listened like a sponge. He didn't speak much, he just watched. Soaked it in. Because here, in this messy, vibrant room, was the part of his life that had never had a voice before. And it was singing. After dinner, Elise found him on the porch, sitting on the swing. "That was a lot," she said, handing him a bottle of water. "It was everything," Nate said. She sat beside him, her hands resting on her lap. The night was cool, and the sound of crickets wrapped around them. "I know it doesn't erase the years," Elise said softly. "And I know we can't just expect you to fold into our family like you never left." Nate turned to her. "You don't have to." He looked out at the stars. "I already have a family," he continued. "The Harpers. Even with all the pain, they're part of who I am. But this, you're part of me too. I don't have to choose one or the other." She smiled. "You're allowed to belong to both." He nodded. "I think I do." A pause passed. Then she said, "Your mom would have loved this porch. She used to talk about having a swing like this when she got old. Sitting outside, drinking iced tea, yelling at kids." "She sounds perfect," Nate whispered. "She was human," Elise replied. "And she was yours." Before Nate left, Letitia handed him a small wooden box. "Camila kept it in her closet," she said. "We didn't know what to do with it after the accident. Now we do." Inside were tiny keepsakes. A hospital wristband. A baby sock. A birthday card never mailed. And a tiny cassette tape. Elise leaned in. It's her voice. Nate clutched the box to his chest. He didn't cry until he got back to the dorm. And even then, it wasn't sadness. It was gratitude. Grief, yes, but not emptiness. That night, he messaged Brandon. "Hey, just met the Morales family. They're everything she must have been. Loud, warm, wild. I didn't lose a family. I gained a second one." Brandon replied 5 minutes later. "That's great, man. Just don't let them replace me. Still got dibs on the title of annoying older brother." Nate laughed and sent back, "Don't worry. No one competes with that." The Harper house was alive with a different kind of energy today, buzzing, expectant, and a little nervous. Nate stood in the living room, glancing out the window every few minutes. He could see Linda bustling in the kitchen, arranging flowers in a vase, and Thomas meticulously straightening picture frames on the walls. Brandon was sitting on the couch, pretending to be indifferent, but sneaking quick glances at the door. Today, the Morales family was coming over. It was a meeting Nate had dreamed about and dreaded in equal measure, a chance to build bridges, but also a risk of old wounds reopening. The doorbell rang. Linda opened the door to reveal Elise first, smiling warmly and carrying a basket of homemade tamales. Behind her followed Leticia, Abuela Maria, and a few cousins, all laughing and greeting with hugs and kisses. Nate stepped forward, heart pounding, and greeted each person carefully. "Welcome," Linda said, her voice steady but soft. The two families moved into the living room. The initial introductions were a tangle of smiles and hesitant conversations. Names were exchanged, stories began to flow. Brandon broke the ice with a joke about Nate's other side being louder than theirs, earning a round of laughter. Over dinner, the walls between them began to dissolve. They shared dishes, memories, and laughter. Linda and Leticia found common ground as mothers who had loved fiercely, while Thomas and Carlos talked quietly about family legacy and the meaning of blood. Nate watched the scene, a swelling warmth in his chest. After dinner, Nate stood to address the room. "I know we're all from different places," he began, voice steady but emotional. "And that family isn't always simple. But what I've learned is that family is more than DNA. It's the love we choose to give and receive." He looked around at faces, both new and old. "I'm so grateful to have both of you in my life. And I hope this is just the beginning." The room was silent for a beat. Then applause, cheers, and a few tears. Brandon wrapped an arm around Nate's shoulders. "We're family," he said simply. And in that moment, Nate knew the past shadow had finally lifted enough for the light to fill the room. The Harper household settled into an unexpected rhythm. The laughter of Morales cousins and Harper siblings mingled through the halls, filling spaces once heavy with silence. Nate found himself sitting between two worlds, bridging the gap with words and shared moments. But even as the warmth grew, the past's wounds lingered beneath the surface, quiet, persistent. One evening, Nate sat with Brandon in the backyard. The sky painted with streaks of orange and purple. Brandon broke the silence first. "You ever think about what it means to forgive?" he asked, poking at the fading embers of their small fire pit. Nate took a slow breath. "I do. I think forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing to not let the pain define us." Brandon nodded thoughtfully. "I spent years holding on to anger like it was a shield. Thought it made me strong. It just made you alone," Nate said softly. Brandon smiled wryly. "Yeah, that too." They sat in companionable quiet, watching stars emerge one by one. Later, Nate would think about how healing was never a straight line. It was messy, hard. But with love, real love, it was possible. Because family wasn't just who you were born to. It was who fought for you, who stood by you, who gave you a second chance. And that was enough. The weight of the past sat heavily on Brandon's shoulders. Nights were restless, filled with memories of words he could never take back. He had always been the loudest in the room, but now silence screamed louder. He found himself alone in the study, sifting through old journals, his and Nate's, trying to understand how things had gone so wrong. That evening, he called Nate. "I'm sorry for everything," he said simply. Nate smiled, voice steady. "I know. And I forgive you." It was a start, a fragile bridge toward a future neither could fully see yet. The months that followed brought change. Brandon worked hard to rebuild his relationship with Nate, not just as brothers but as friends. He attended therapy, faced his anger, and learned to express vulnerability. Nate continued his studies, buoyed by the support of both families. The Morales clan welcomed him warmly, and the Harpers grew more open and affectionate. One afternoon, Nate and Brandon sat on the porch, sharing iced tea and laughter. "Guess we're doing okay," Brandon said. "Better than okay," Nate replied. The future was uncertain, but they would face it together. The promise between Nate and Brandon wasn't spoken, but lived every day in the way Brandon checked in after late nights, or how Nate stood up for his brother among friends. They had learned that family was not just about blood, but about actions, trust, and forgiveness. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Brandon looked at Nate and said quietly, "No matter what happens, I've got your back." Nate smiled, the warmth in his chest spreading. "Always." And with that, their bond, once fractured, was stronger than ever. The sun set over Charlotte, casting golden light through the windows of the Harper home. The house was filled with warmth, laughter from Nate and Brandon playing video games in the living room, Linda preparing dinner, and Thomas reading quietly in his study. Nate paused in the hallway, watching his family with a full heart. They were imperfect, complicated, sometimes messy, but theirs. Not because of DNA alone, but because of love chosen and fought for. He thought back to the boy who had once felt like an outsider, unsure where he belonged. Now he belonged here in this home with these people. And as Brandon caught his eye and smiled, Nate knew one thing for sure. Family isn't about sharing blood. It's about sharing a life together.